Yes, Tom. You wanted to see me. I announced my arrival at the managing director's office, having been signaled by him. Yes, thank you for coming, Mike, he replied with a smile as he stood up from his desk. I'd like you to meet George, whose company has taken an interest in our new gearbox. Nice to meet you, I replied, extending my hand in greeting as he started to rise from his seat to meet my gaze. And then I stopped, as they say, on the spot. Mike! George Campion, grunted in surprise. Mr. Campion, I replied formally, equally surprised, and let my hand drop again. You two know each other? Tom grinned, apparently not noticing the hostility that existed between us, or perhaps we were just too shocked to openly display it. How do you two know each other? Mike worked for me a few years ago. Campion, or George as I'd always known him, beat me to it, telling the truth but omitting the other, more controversial connection. That'll make things easier, Tom continued. A brilliant engineer but never known for his people skills, and still not realizing how uncomfortable the other two men in his office had suddenly become. Perhaps you could show George our production facility? Maybe I could, I muttered, turned my back on Campion and headed for the door, leaving it up to him to decide whether he would follow me or not. He did. I guess he had to, and I quickly strode down the hallway, hoping he'd keep up with me, and intending not to stop until we were out of the office and at the edge of the parking lot and alone. What the hell are you doing here? I growled angrily, turning to face him, not the least bit bothered by the fact that he was bigger than me, and apparently in every way, which was probably the root cause of the tension between us. I swear, Mike, I had no idea you worked here, he sighed, raising his hands in a peace sign. We hadn't heard from you in years. We weren't even sure you were still alive. Thanks to you, I'm almost gone, I snapped, wondering why I didn't just nail this guy like I should have done all those years ago, back in the days when I had all my fingers. Sorry, he sighed, shrugging his shoulders. What else can I say? I stared at him, fighting the urge to allow myself just one punch that it would take for me to drop him to the floor and not get up for a while longer. He knew it too and stood there, nervous but making no move to defend himself. If he'd known how much easier I could hurt him than the last time we'd met, he might not have done it. If he knew the things I'd been involved in over the years, he might not even have done it and gone off to search the horizon. That's history, Mike, he broke the silence, nearly choking on his words. A lot of water has flowed off the bridge since then. And a lot of blood, I muttered to myself, gritting my teeth but feeling my inner rage subside until I felt myself breathing calmly again. Too bad none of them were yours. How's that, bitch? Fine, Campion replied succinctly, ignoring the insult I'd hurled at his wife and not wanting to talk about her anymore. Perhaps all was not well in the Campion household, and that didn't disappoint me in the least. And child? She's fine too, Mike, he replied, suddenly brightening up and risking a smile. Ginny's 4 years old now, and she's a happy and beautiful little girl. So who did she take after? The big question. The one that would have been asked by the elephant in the room, had it been there. She takes after Jenny, Campion answered confidently. And not on me? Not exactly. Or are you? Not so that you notice, he answered calmly. That's right. We better go check out the factory, I muttered, turned my back on the bastard, and strode away, again not paying attention to whether he was following me or not. I went to a top university and graduated with a good degree in engineering, but at the time, I didn't know what career path to take. I think I was as surprised as anyone that I was attracted to the Army recruitment team that visited our university in my final year, and even more so that I was signed up for short-term service in the Royal Engineers. I immediately became an officer and committed to 3 years of service to the Queen, with the option to make it permanent at the end of the term, or not. These turned out to be the 3 best years of my life, despite the fact that there were no major conflicts during that time, or perhaps because the sense of camaraderie was such as I had never experienced. I made captain, but at the end of my 3 years of service, despite all attempts to convince me to stay, I decided that I did not consider the Army my calling. To tell the truth, It was just hard for me to imagine killing anyone if hostilities broke out, which they surely would at some point, and I was in a position where I would have to do it. This was in spite of the fact that my skill with weapons, especially a pistol, surprised me. If only I had known at the time how easy it would be to use a handgun in a real-world situation, I might not have gotten away so easily. After leaving the Army and getting over the hangover of all hangovers that my fellow junior officers felt it necessary to give me as a discharge present, I found that 3 years of service had not gone to waste. The time spent in the field with the Tank Recovery Squad and my engineering qualifications allowed me to get a job with one of the companies that manufactured them. Maybe not exactly tanks, but a whole range of armored vehicles that were to become increasingly necessary as conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere heated up. I was never a pure engineer, more of a sort out the faults and make things work kind of guy, and this, plus my Army time, made me the perfect cover when dealing with our customers, whether British or from other countries, often in bloody awful places. Life was great and was soon to get even better when I turned my attention to Jenny, the boss's assistant, and even more so when we discovered it was mutual. 3 dates and both of us were not virgins, but without too many questions we found ourselves a very comfortable match in my very comfortable bed. 6 more months and lots of bedtime and I popped the question, she gave the appropriate answer, and we became Mr. and Mrs. Mike Jones. My seemingly happy and relatively carefree life continued. We settled into a new house, albeit with a huge mortgage, and 2 years later I was informed that I would soon be a dad. Oh, the bliss. We hadn't planned for it, but as Jenny's lump was just starting to show, my joy grew and the whole world seemed perfect. And suddenly, it wasn't. There's something you should know, Mike, Jenny surprised me one evening. What's wrong, dear? I asked, admiring her soft blonde hair and stroking it. It's the baby, Jenny murmured. What's wrong with him? I demanded, suddenly panicking as I worried about what she was about to tell me. Nothing, she snapped back, confusing me. Then there's nothing wrong with our baby. What's the problem? That's the problem, Jenny sighed. It might not be our baby. Nonsense, I laughed, wondering what she could be thinking. Of course it's our baby. What I mean, honey, my wife whispered, a tear rolling down her cheek. It may not be your baby. I stopped laughing. And even stopped breathing. I'm sorry, Mike, but I just couldn't hold it in any longer. Who's the father? I demanded, holding back tears. It could be you, Mike, she dodged the obvious question. Or, came out of my mouth and I nearly choked on the word. George, she sobbed, and it was the death blow to our marriage. George was, of course, none other than George Campion, her boss and my boss at the time. When did it start? I asked, nearly sobbing. But that wasn't the question I should have asked. It was more a matter of the fact that they just never stopped. They didn't stop when we were first dating and only calmed down a bit after we got married. My wife had been having fun with our boss since her 19th birthday, when Campion invited her to the celebration and ended up seducing her. Not surprisingly, she decided it would be best if we didn't tell each other about our previous history. That night my life changed, and indeed I myself changed, and perhaps some would conclude, not for the better. Perhaps it would have been better if I had gone and beaten the bastard up and gotten over it, and then maybe I wouldn't have subsequently committed other behaviors that I wasn't so proud of. Perhaps the fact that he too was ex-military, but not an engineer, but a Royal Marine, and the heavyweight champion of the combined forces, could certainly have influenced my decision. That, and what I discovered when I burst into his office the next afternoon. Instead, I took the easy route, left my wife and told his wife about what was going on between our spouses. Both divorces were surprisingly quick, and theirs were messy, despite the lack of children. Ours was far less serious, not even a question of paternity when Jenny and Campion moved in together quickly, once his wife kicked him out and he took responsibility for the child. It wasn't until later that I realized the interest he took in other employees' children, but having none of his own, maybe it went to his head. Or maybe it didn't, and it was just my imagination. It's not my problem now. At least I got a house, albeit with virtually no equity because of the mortgage. It's hard to believe now that I so easily turned my back on what could have possibly been my child. I guess I just didn't think about the possibility. I drank, or at least I started drinking. but memories of the hangovers I suffered after being discharged from the army kept me from overdoing it while I was job hunting. Army? Why not? As it turned out, the why not was that they weren't really interested in a returning officer running away from a broken marriage. I was pissed, but truth be told, the signals I must have been signaling at the time hardly made me a good fit. Don't laugh, but I considered joining the French Foreign Legion, but didn't immediately realize that would have been a disaster, so I went back to square one. No job, no plans, and a house I couldn't afford and hated anyway. I assessed my situation, realizing that while I was still a young man, my entire career had been in the military or military equipment, and listed all my contacts that came to mind to decide which of them might be useful, if any. Most of them fell below the line as I was hardly going to be a civil servant, and governments in countries like Nigeria did not need people like me. There was one name I hesitated to put on my list but then kept coming back to it. The old Mike would have crossed it out and picked up an eraser, but the new Mike didn't. Could I? Would I? Hey, Carl. I started the phone conversation and introduced myself, surprised at how quickly he invited me over. What went wrong in your life? What do you even think about it? Asked Carl without mincing words. I told him and he just nodded. He didn't seem to care about it as much as the British Army. You made captain? He asked, and I confirmed that I had. Did you serve? Followed the next question, and I was forced to admit that I had not. A qualified engineer? I think that question went over well. Rifleman level with a rifle and submachine gun. It's rare to find an officer capable of marksmanship, he laughed at his own joke. His next question, however, made me freeze for a moment. You've never shot anyone. If it came to a critical situation, would you be able to? Yes, I answered, trying not to give away the tremor in my voice. The image of Campion in my scope helped me a lot. Well, maybe you'll find out if you really can, Carl snapped back. Because if you can't, you probably won't get your award in time. That's how I became a mercenary. A soldier of fortune. Weapons for hire, or in my case, a gun, a set of wrenches, and a theodolite. After renting a house on a long-term lease, I found myself on a plane bound for the Middle East to be part of a multinational squad to protect a leader in the Middle East. I will call him king because he was. At least sort of, although some may have felt that his record of protecting the civil rights of his people left much to be desired. The West couldn't openly support him, but he was a bastion against the rise of Islamic forces that threatened even worse things, and that's where we mercenaries came in. My job with the small squad was to monitor and maintain our equipment, which didn't seem too dangerous, and remained so for quite some time. When it did, it came without warning and was a personal test for me to see if I would freeze or not. It was also a test to see if I could keep the promise I had made to Carl back in the UK. The armored personnel carrier drove past our workshop without even noticing us, nor did we pay much attention to it. Not until the engine roared and the vehicle rolled straight toward the gate to the courtyard, where the king's quarters were located, breaking through the first barrier and crashing right into the anti-tank barriers, where it came to a crunching halt and about a dozen heavily armed fighting soldiers poured out of it. Firing short, accurate bursts at the guards caught off guard, they veered to the left to interrupt and kill as many of them as possible and as quickly as possible, and a couple of grenades discouraged the others from leaving the safety of the barracks. Then they regrouped and headed back towards the royal chambers, taking out 2 ceremonial guardsmen whose swords were no match for their automatic weapons. All I had was my sidearm, and the same could be said for the 3 mechanics who, bless their cotton socks, were brave or foolish enough to follow my lead. Had we faced them head-on, we would have been annihilated in seconds, but by sheer luck or will of fate, because it certainly wasn't due to military cunning, we attacked them from the side as they rushed back across the corral with only limited cover in the form of the machine we were working on. Without hesitation, I dropped to a knee, calmly removed the automatic from the safety, took aim, and opened aimed fire, not wasting more than 1 bullet on each of the creeps before switching to the next. Fortunately, though apparently not entirely successfully, 3 of my men followed suit, and in a matter of moments we took out 6 of them and at least a couple more who were looking for escape. But it was too late, because by then the other soldiers had recovered from their surprise and were showering them with a hail of bullets. Silence. Such silence that it was shocking. The horrifying cacophony of death subsided as quickly as it had begun, and the others, like me, watched the carnage, marveling that any of us were unharmed. Then came the shock. Different people deal with the aftermath of battle in different ways. Some seek solitude, others just want to kick themselves. I was the former, and it wasn't very pleasant. I bit the head off the unit commander as he clapped me on the back and congratulated me heartily. Not normally a very sensible thing to do, as he was a former SAS man who probably had 3 ways to kill me just by smiling. He did smile, but not like that. He just told me to report to him when I got my wound dressed. What? I reached up to touch my cheek, which was starting to hurt by then, but my arm was covered in blood. Just a wound, he brushed off my problem. When it heals, you'll look like a pirate. The women will love that. He understood. He'd certainly seen it all before. What a show you put on, Mike, he greeted me an hour later as I stood before him, the major in his office, my wound patched but still sore. I had 3 good men with me, sir, I replied. They did a good job, Mike, he grinned. But it looks like you personally took out 5 of them with that little damn gun. Screw it, I missed one of them, I replied, and we laughed. It wasn't actually very funny, but finally the tension that I had no way of releasing was gone, and the 2 of us laughed heartily at a very unfortunate joke. Seriously, Mike, he interrupted the fun, where the hell did you learn to shoot like that? In the British Army, I shrugged. It just worked itself out. What the world has come to, he sighed. A bloody engineer with a sense of humor who can shoot accurately. What's next? I knew better than to offer no answer, so I just smirked back at him. A compliment, even a perverse one, from a senior comrade with his track record is not something to be taken lightly. The king has confirmed the reward for the 4 of you, he announced, surprising me. 3 of your men will each be able to buy a new car. I could use a new car, sir, I responded, feeling the meeting growing more informal. The men will have to think about a Ford, and you can think about a Jaguar, Mike, he grinned. And just when I thought I was about to be let go, he suddenly became serious again. Mike, have you ever been to Africa? He asked abruptly. 3 weeks on a business trip to Kenya and a vacation in Morocco, I replied, generally unimpressed. Central Africa, he continued, almost growling. They need an engineering officer there, and it will be twice as profitable. Why would that be? I asked, already guessing the answer. Simple arithmetic, my boy, he grinned, relaxing again. Twice the risk, twice the money, and a bonus if our client wins that day that will make your mouth water. Twice the risk? More like 3 times, the major admitted. Our man is trying to overthrow some bloodthirsty despot who won't quit. And our man? Oma, the current leader's cousin, and apparently not much better than him, but he and his supporters are the ones paying the price. Sounds fair, I nodded in agreement, which seemed to go down well. But why do they need me? They need engineering experience, and the last 2 didn't last long, he informed me, becoming serious again, which was a sure sign of what could happen to them. This time they need someone who can take care of themselves. Someone who can shoot accurately and won't hesitate when it comes to fighting. When do I leave? Damn, I really wasn't the same Mike I'd been not so long ago. So a few days later, with enough premium in the bank to buy a Ferrari, I and 5 others found ourselves on an executive jet bound for Dubai to make various connections. The others were headed to Europe and possibly beyond, while I was headed to some godforsaken country in Central Africa, somewhere east of Nigeria and north of South Africa. I made a 2-hour stopover on the way, but I was facing a 4-day layover, described as a vacation, but I suspect more likely due to a lack of people willing to fly where I was going. They were fine with the hotel, though, and soon I was sitting on my balcony at the 5-star Grosvenor Hotel, holding a glass of something in my hand. After a quick dinner, I went to one of the clubs the hotel had recommended to me, where I discovered that my scar gave me a seedy look that made other guys go out of my way. As my former boss suggested, it also acted as a magnet for women, or maybe it was the money I was waving around. As it happened, I ended up with a professional, a tall Russian blonde who proved that money was worth money. All was well and even better than I had hoped. However, the wonderful new romance ended after breakfast the next morning when Olga, the new, albeit temporary love of my life, took my money, kissed me, and left me her card. The next day was spent exploring Dubai, including a boat ride, a visit to the rugby field where my uncle had played 10 years ago, and even the sewing of 2 new shirts, which were made for me by tailors on the outskirts of the city in 24 hours. After returning to the hotel and taking a relaxing shower, I took the long elevator ride, intending to have dinner at one of the hotel's great restaurants and spend another night in the city. This night started very differently from the previous one, except that the girl was Indian, from Kerala, not loaded, exquisitely beautiful, but different. "Maybe I'll hold you to it," Neha said. "Where did you get the scar?" she finally asked, and the novelty of the question became apparent. "From a terrorist's bullet," I replied, smirking and surprised when I realized that I was actually telling the truth. "Sort of." "Take the other one out," Neha laughed, figuring I was joking. "You probably got your cheek caught on a nail or something." "Do you want to see my other wounds?" I asked. "Where are they?" she giggled. "Where I can't show you in public," I replied, lying that I didn't really have any, except for a scratch on my knee where I hit a table a few days ago. "My hotel is right down the road," I challenged her. "What are you waiting for?" My petite Indian beauty accepted the challenge, took my hand in hers, and led me through the crowded room straight to the exit. "Well, here we are," I finally sighed. "Mike Jones?" a big smart guy standing at the entrance asked. "Who's asking?" was my obvious answer when asked such things in places like this. "Carl sent me, and there's an airplane waiting for you at the airport, standing on the tarmac." "You've got to be kidding me," I growled in frustration. "I'm sorry, but I'm serious, Captain Jones. I'm afraid you're going to have to take a rain check." "I'll have to get my things out of my room," I remarked, hoping I'd get to fondle the gorgeous Neha at least a little. "Your stuff is already packed and in the car, Captain?" He spoiled my plan. "Sorry, but the plane is really waiting. We have 2 other guys looking for you." "So it really was a bullet wound," Neha spoke for the first time, looking at me with a slightly different look. "She almost missed," was all I could think of to say. "She almost destroyed you," Neha remarked. "Sorry, but the plane is actually waiting on the tarmac, Captain," the man repeated, trying not to give away his excitement, and I took Neha in my arms with an exaggerated sigh, kissed her, and then had to let go. "My card, Mike," she said, handing me a very chic-looking business card. "Stop by and see me next time you're here." That's pretty much what happened. I was being driven away in a huge black Mercedes, trying to forget what pleasures I had just missed, and the beautiful Neha was waving goodbye to me. "Sorry about that, Captain." A man who didn't give his name spoke up after a while. "Some woman, this Neha." "Do you know her?" replied I in surprise. "Only by sight and reputation, unfortunately," he grinned back. "She would be a good prey for any man." "But she only works in a restaurant," I muttered, looking at the card she gave me. "Look again," he commanded, and I looked. "Jesus," I replied. "She's the manager. She only looks 20. "She's 27, he informed me, amused by my surprise. To us Europeans, Indian girls usually look young, and she not only manages it, but her family owns it, and it's one of the best restaurants in Dubai. They have places in half the capitals of the world." "As you say, not a bad find," I sighed, and that was the end of our conversation, and I began to ponder if I was doing the right thing. The plane was indeed waiting for us on the tarmac when we arrived at the site, and honestly, my first thoughts were whether it would even be able to leave. It turned out to be the Eastern European equivalent of a DC-3 Dakota, but not as beautiful and not preserved even half as well as the DC-3 SI had seen. I didn't panic, but I sure as hell wondered about it, and my first impression of the pilot did little to dissuade me. He, Vladimir, looked like something left over from World War II, which the airplane may well have belonged to, and his conversation left a lot to be desired. How wrong was I? By then, I knew a little about questionable airplanes, drunks, and even worse pilots, but Vladimir, despite his lack of conversational skills, appeared to be a master at the wheel of his machine. I joined the 3 other passengers already aboard the plane, but got nothing but grunts from 2 of them and a look of pure hatred from the third. Perhaps they were angry at me for keeping them waiting. The takeoff went perfectly, and the sound of twin engines suggested that the beast was probably in better condition than its appearance would suggest. Perhaps there was a reason for it, but I decided it was best not to consider what it might be. For several hours we flew without uttering a word, although the noise the airplane was making would have made it difficult to do so. Then the nose of the plane dipped down, it backed up, and I realized we had landed, only because the pilot was unlikely to turn off the engines if we were still in the air. I had hoped. Vladimir crawled back in, told me to stay put, opened the door, and kicked out the other 3 who left without much enthusiasm. And to this day I have no idea who they were or what country we left them in. My faithful pilot climbed back up onto the fuselage, handed me half a bottle of vodka, honored me with a peculiar smile, and returned to the cockpit. 10 minutes later we were rushing down the unfamiliar runway again, and then we flew off like a bird. With no one to talk to and not enough light to read by, I reluctantly let my thoughts drift back to the day Jenny burst her bombshell, and also to what I'd discovered when I'd gone to meet the damned Campion. I jumped out of the house, terrified of what I might do if I stayed. By the time I got home that night, somewhat thinner of course, Jenny was already in bed, so I slept on the couch. She had gotten up before I woke up and apparently decided not to wake me up. This was probably a mistake on her part, because if she had, we might have gotten somewhere. Eventually, I got up, took a shower, got dressed, and then sat there wondering what the hell to do next. My beautiful little world had been shattered, and shattered by the person I loved most in the world. During lunch, I went to get a dog hair after needlessly biting the head off a bartender who was too talkative. It was then that I made the decision to go and meet George freaking Campion. To get his side of the story, though, I had no idea how that would help. Maybe I had something else in mind. I drove to the factory, past the guards at the gate, half expecting them to deny me entry when I showed them my pass. Once inside, I nodded to the receptionist and a few coworkers, almost not understanding how they could act so normal when the world had changed so drastically. I didn't go into my office but headed straight for the director's suite, ignoring the woman behind the counter as I floated past, barely hearing her say that Mr. Campion was busy and couldn't be disturbed. Maybe it was for the best? Swinging the door open, I stepped inside and froze. Campion was indeed there, presumably in a meeting with the other 3 principals, so it was no surprise that his assistant was also present. The 3 men were dressed as you would expect formally, even the ties were out of place. The assistant, Jenny, my wife of course, was wearing high-heeled shoes, a pair of not too flashy earrings, and that was it. "Shit!" growled Campion, spotting me, and everyone else in the room, including me, fell shocked silent. "Nothing's going on," Jenny gasped, which seemed rather silly to me, since she was standing surrounded by 4 fully dressed men. "It's not what you think, Mike," she pleaded, tears already rolling down her cheeks as she took a step towards me. I finally felt the engines of the DC-3-like airplane stall again, the nose down, and again made a flawless landing, which, considering the condition of the grass runway that awaited me as I exited the plane, was no small accomplishment. In the dim light, I was taken to the edge of the runway under the cover of the surrounding foliage, only to hear the roar of the airplane's engines, and it descended back onto the grass runway and into the air. I was about to ask why it flew away so quickly when I got my answer. A shell, probably a mortar shell, exploded a couple hundred yards from where I was standing with a blinding flash. It wouldn't hit the airplane, but the second one might well have. "Let's get out of here," my guide suggested. "And by the way, welcome to hell." I didn't need a second invitation. It was truly horrible. We lived in tents that we had to move frequently unless they spotted us. The temperature was a little lower than in the Middle East, but with the high humidity it was almost unbearable. There were insects everywhere, some as big as chickens. I exaggerate about chickens, of course, but you get the point. We also had to be shelled regularly while our enemy tried to gain a foothold on us. It was not a good time to be told that things were not going well for us, although I could quickly realize that myself. The doubling of salary lost its luster pretty quickly, and the prospect of a mouth-watering bonus seemed unfulfilling. The problem, of course, was that you couldn't just say, "I've changed my mind. Please take me home." If I wanted to pull out, I'd have to try to survive the 6 months I'd signed up for, and pray that Vladimir and his old airplane were still in one piece, or hope against hope that things would change. It got better, and then it got worse again. My team of mechanics, some of whom were locals, a German, 2 Frenchmen, and 2 guys of dubious origin, had pretty much lost enthusiasm for their work. More accurately, they were pissed off and doubted they would ever see any form of civilization again. Their future didn't look very bright. If I wanted to get out of this situation in one piece, I had to give them some hope, and that wasn't easy. We looked around the base, as it were, and I was surprised to find that our man, Oma, was indeed with us, though I half expected him to be somewhere in the palace, keeping out of the fighting. Perhaps he wasn't so bad after all? It soon became apparent that most of our heavy weapons were out of action, or as my French commander told me, HS, and there were no spares to get them back in working order. Without them, we had no serious answer to the attacks of the thugs, as the enemy on our side were called. They were, of course, beginning to realize this, and their attacks were becoming more and more brazen and direct. "You've seen the problem, Captain. Now what the hell can you do about it?" Those were the first words Oma said to me when I was brought to him, and he was sitting there surrounded by 2 senior officers, 1 black and 1 white. "Well, I can put in 1 more medium machine gun if I take down all the others, but then they'll all be written off. Same with the mortars, although we'll have to jury-rig them since they're all defective. I may be able to get this old 75mm one to work, but I doubt it." "That's about what your predecessor said, but he never succeeded," remarked the white officer. "He didn't live long enough to recognize it," remarked the black, not very encouragingly. "That's still not enough," Oma remarked, smiling despite the bad position he was in. "We need more." "We don't have more," grumbled the white man, who was beginning to like me. There might be a way, I sighed, almost regretting my silence, and soon found all 3 of them staring at me, waiting for me to tell them how I was going to accomplish the impossible. The heavy machine guns the Russians have basically the same problem. It's part of the trigger mechanism that has failed. If I had 5 of those machine guns, you'd have 5 more heavy machine guns. "We don't have 5 spare triggers, you fool," snapped the white guy. "But we could make them," I suggested. "There's a lathe and other equipment in the shop, and Renee claims to have experience with it." "It might be possible." "What's the problem?" Omak asked, smiling obediently, but knowing full well that there was more to it. "We need a template," I sighed. "The others are all cracked and uneven." "We don't have a template," my troubled boyfriend, whose name I wasn't even told. "I think we do," Oma sighed, guessing what I was implying. "We still have the last of those guns working." "No way in hell," the officer shouted. "It's the only one that still works properly. Without it, we're screwed, so there's no way you're taking it apart." "Without the extra firepower, we're finished anyway," the black officer commented. "Do it, Captain Jones," I ordered. "Let's pray that in the meantime we can hold them off. When a situation is at rock bottom, that's when real men come to the forefront and change the course of history. At least that's what happens in the movies. Unfortunately, it's not like that in real life, and if things are bad, chances are they're only going to get worse, and my brilliant idea turned out to be a complete failure. We removed the mechanism from the last working machine gun and hurriedly returned it to the workshop where another non-working machine gun was waiting for us, intending to get it back to the perimeter line as soon as we had successfully made a replica. Unfortunately, we then discovered that René might not be as proficient with the lathe as he had assumed, or the metal we were using wasn't good enough. He gave it a try. He made 3 pieces. 2 didn't fit, and the third broke in half when we tried to put it back into the machine gun. We stood with our heads bowed, wondering what to do next, not realizing that things could get worse, when suddenly it did. The sudden burst of fire meant that another attack had begun on our position, and we all fell silent, hoping that it would subside and that it was only a small skirmish, for if it was not, no cavalry would come to save us. I looked around my group of 8 mechanics and saw every emotion from despair to calm acceptance of our fate, for they all looked to me as leader. Our defensive fire was certainly instantaneous, but without the heavier machine gun, the difference was obvious even to us. Obvious and heartbreaking as we looked toward the defensive perimeter behind a line of dense trees and brush, no more than 200 meters from where we waited, knowing that violent death was on its way. "Merde!" shouted Renee, as we heard our only remaining medium gun hiss and fall silent, and the remaining crackle of rifle fire seemed so pathetic. "They're breaking through," one of my men remarked. "They're going to overtake us." You can't imagine what that remark, however obvious, could do to you. We all knew what it meant. There would be no mercy. Anyone who survived the first onslaught they would not spare, for they would take no prisoners. Shrugging their shoulders one by one, the men boldly picked up their personal weapons, a rather motley collection of outdated rifles and pistols. Not much to counter the 100 or more heavily armed infantrymen we all knew would soon break through the forest perimeter and into the compound. As I drew my gun, my last thoughts were of Jenny, wherever she was, and whether she would ever know how I met my death in a faraway land. Would she mourn for me? Would she miss me? What would she say to me now if she saw my final state? I grinned unfunny, imagining her telling me to use the brains God gave me, her standard answer whenever she had no other answer. Use my brain? Screw it! Sometimes you don't see what's staring you in the face. Where the hell is that firing mechanism? I yelled, addressing no one in particular. It doesn't work, Captain, someone echoed. It's useless. Not that one, I shouted back. The original one, modeled after it. Several men realized what I had in mind, and with a satisfying click, the original mechanism slid into place of the Russian pistol that had been silent and unused for so long. Ammunition, I shouted, but the two had already begun to haul the heavy metal box up to the cannon, which by this time was lined up on the tree line, from which we knew the enemy might at any moment fall upon us. Too late, shouted someone as they broke through, 30 out of 40, perhaps in the first wave, pouring fire on everything that moved around them, and the light return fire of the few men left around the camp had little effect on their rapid advance. Wrong ammo, a soldier sobbed, trying to insert a roll into his rifle as the attackers annihilated the small band of defenders between us and them. Perhaps it was then that Rene showed himself in all his glory. He shoved the other man out of the way, turned the ammunition roll the other way, and slid it into the welcoming slot. Then he leapt for the gun and turned it around to meet the first of the attackers, who by then were almost upon us, bullets flying everywhere, the screams of the wounded on both sides chilling us. Music to my ears. I am not particularly musical even at the best of times, but the heavy boom of that fine Russian gun was the most beautiful music I have ever heard. We might all die that day, but we would not leave without taking many of them with us. I didn't have time to ponder what happened to that young man who had left the army years ago, not knowing if he could actually survive killing someone. A heavy gun pierced a gap in the attacking crowd, but a few still broke through and closed in on us. My gun was hot in my hand, and I shot them off every chance I got. Some of them were so close, I had to shoot into the gap between my men. We were being overtaken or not overtaken as my men chopped down the last of them, sometimes literally with bayonets the old-fashioned way. Then the next wave came upon us, much more numerous, but by then we were ready for it, with Rene firing his pistol in short, precise bursts, and the three of us manning it and keeping up the ammunition, while we all thanked the Lord that Rene somehow knew what he was doing, and prayed to a God we might not have had time for before, that the gun wouldn't jam. The thing is, in the middle of a battle, you have no idea what's really going on. Maybe some general does know, but we didn't have one on hand, so we just kept fighting for our lives. Of course, we didn't know that the attackers had rushed right into our ambush, though we didn't realize we had set it. The last thing they expected was that by breaking through our defenses, they would run into the heaviest gun positioned far from our front line. Who could have? It was a ridiculous piece of military planning. So ridiculous that it turned into a massacre as their troops poured into the kill site and our surviving troops on the perimeter closed in behind them. I lost 4 of my men that day, including poor Rene, but we had little time to mourn them. We had no idea that they were planning their major offensive that day, and of course the truth of the matter is that if we hadn't happened to take that machine gun out of the front line, we would have been defeated, and I would have ended up in an unmarked mass grave somewhere in a far, far away land. As it was, my only wounds were the little finger on my left hand, which was torn off without me even noticing it at the time, and a shallow wound on my chest. I could pretend it was from a bloodthirsty enemy, but it was actually from one of my boys when he lost his grip on a bayonet. This battle didn't win the Civil War, but it certainly turned the tide. News of Omok's victory convinced various forces to side with him, seeing at last a real chance to depose his highly unpopular cousin. Within 10 weeks, Oma had taken a major city in the country, suffering relatively few casualties on either side, and, perhaps more importantly for us mercenaries, a gold mining complex, not a very large one, but without which the huge bonus we had all been promised might not have been paid. Personally, I took almost no part in the skirmishes that followed, busying myself with replenishing our supplies and adding captured items to our inventory. But the day after this first major success, Oma did pull me aside to speak to me privately. "Brilliant military tactics to take the heavy cannon away, Captain Jones," he congratulated me, patting me on the shoulder. "Total luck," I grinned back. "But my men have performed admirably under fire." "Nonsense," he grinned, barely containing his laughter. The tactics were perfect. We set a trap, the enemy was ambushed in a classic ambush, and we defeated a vastly superior force. "If you say so, sir," I grinned back. "Yes," he replied, winking at me. "That's what the press will hear, that's what the world will believe, and that's what my bastard cousin will have to face when he tries to rally his troops." I just smirked back, shrugging my shoulders in agreement. "Stick to that story, Captain, and your whole crew will get a little more, and you'll get a bonus on your bonus." "Consider it done, sir," I agreed, saluting him and wondering if I would have lived to see my bonus if I had argued. The press release did come out, though, and the world learned of Omaha's brilliant strategy. It mentioned the help given by a junior officer with the rank of captain, but somehow they managed to misspell my damn name. Women? What about women? As unpleasant as it may be to some sensitive people, where there are men with money to burn and nothing else to do with it, there will be women willing to help them with their problems. Olga in Dubai was somewhere at the very top, and the women in this hole were at the very bottom. Almost all of them were lecherous older sluts, and the few who had not yet reached that stage were striving for it. To their credit, I don't think it was their fault. But I refrained. There was only one of them, a pretty enough young African woman, easy enough on the eyes for me to be tempted. But the line was too long, and officer status in this situation offered no advantages. A dollar, pound, or euro meant more than rank or position. Unfortunately, it was unlikely to remain so attractive for long. So I abstained. That all changed as we swept through the war-torn country, women and girls greeting us as their saviors, while their own men may have died in battle or simply kept a low profile. It was then that my abstinence failed me. I confess I took my prize twice as a conquering hero, a prize, I should add, on both occasions given freely. It may not have been my finest moment, but they both seemed to enjoy it. Then things changed again. Florence appeared. Oh, Florence. Our troops stormed into what was flatteringly called the capital, but was really nothing more than a small town in which not a single shot was fired. My contingent arrived only a day or so later, and we set about finding a place to base ourselves, and then a place to sleep. Soldiers being what they are, and with the town still functioning on some level, there was room on the list for a drink, and the main bar in town was quite suitable for that. Of course we weren't alone. The place was already crowded with other soldiers with exactly the same idea. Then again, where men congregate, a certain type of woman congregates as well, though I was content to just stand and watch the merry-go-round, sipping a nice cold but unfortunately not very tasty beer. I knew I shouldn't have interfered, but a girlish scream caught my attention. Squeezing through the crowd gathered around me, I soon discovered the cause. A young woman who was being mistreated, and who, unlike the other whores in the bar, was objecting rather vehemently. I forced myself to look away as it was none of my business, and I didn't want to face the rugged African soldier molesting her. I told myself I was a damn fool even as I squeezed through them to confront them, using my best officer voice to order them to stop. They, or rather he, stopped, but only to stare at me angrily in bewilderment. "Mind your own fucking business," he growled. "Let her go now," I barked at him, hoping it sounded a lot more confident than I felt. "Take him. Stupid white officer will be left alone," he tossed to his buddies, soldiers who were destroying without a second thought, probably just the day before. And they took a step toward me, smirks appearing on their faces that took my breath away. People were destroying their officers in this conflict, and I inwardly cursed myself for being such a fool and looked for a way out. The girl, whatever color she was doomed to her fate. There was no saving her, and it wasn't my problem. Please! Perhaps it was the pleading tone of her voice, or maybe it was the French accent. But more likely it was the way her eyes caught mine and stared defiantly at me. Startling clear blue eyes that silently told me I was her only chance and begged me not to leave her. Idiot. Damn idiot that I was. Instead of turning away, I stood my ground, knowing there was only one way to keep them from beating the crap out of me and possibly destroying me. I pulled out my gun. My gun! My small caliber pistol that had served me so well in 2 battles. They hesitated and then apparently decided that I wouldn't use it, and if I did, I wouldn't be able to take down more than one of them. Either way, the whole place went quiet, every eye fixed on us waiting to see what would happen next. Who's first? I gasped with laughter, waving my gun back and forth, having already decided that the guy holding the girl would go to his own first, even if the others got me. He was a brave guy, I had to hand it to him, and he'd obviously faced death before, realizing, perhaps from the way I handled the gun, carelessly taking the safety off, that I knew how to use it, and would use it, and that from this distance I was unlikely to miss. I could see the fear in his eyes, realizing that perhaps he too had made a fatal mistake, but he didn't flinch. As I pulled the trigger, I knew it would end badly, but it was too late to retreat. Oh shit. What I'd been through, all for some damn woman I didn't even know. Stand down, came a deep, commanding voice from somewhere behind me, a voice my mind struggled to name. Lower your weapons, Captain, that's an order, came the next command. You men stand back and let the girl go. We all hesitated, but no one moved from their seats, and there was an anxious silence in the room, save for the girl's quiet sobs. Now, came a sharp shout from behind me, and I, finally recognizing the voice, lowered my gun. The men in front of me realized who it was too, perhaps the only person in Africa who could have made them back down like that at that moment. Put the gun away, Captain, Oma ordered more calmly, standing between us and glaring at my opponents until they backed away, and the one holding the girl let her go, albeit reluctantly, and she rushed to hug me, flooding with tears. However, that didn't stop them from looking at me with hatred in their eyes, making it clear that the matter was not yet settled. Damn fools, Oma scolded his soldiers. You're lucky he didn't shoot you all. No such luck, one of them muttered, still looking at me angrily. You think not? Oma continued. Do you realize who this officer is? You don't recognize him? You don't recognize the man who saved your pathetic lives in this hellhole just a few weeks ago? The looks of hatred disappeared and were quickly replaced by smiles. A buzz went up in the bar, and suddenly every man in the bar wanted to shake my hand or buy me a drink. Split up and take the girl with you, Oma suggested quietly, keeping his eyes on the big soldier. I'll take it from here. Thank you, sir, I sighed gratefully, the adrenaline fading away, and the realization of how close I was to meeting my maker came over me again. We're equals now, he grinned. Why? I asked. For spelling your name wrong, he chuckled, and then burst into laughter. His rolling laughter was infectious, and soon the whole bar joined in, everyone including me. Everyone except the poor young woman still clinging to me. We had broken up. We left, and I led her down the dusty street until I found a run-down convenience store for privacy. What the hell were you doing in a bar like that? I demanded angrily, taking off my shirt and wrapping it around my shoulders. I thought they could give you a job, she whimpered, still clinging to me. Why do you need a job? I asked, calming down a little, unable to understand how such a young, pretty white woman could be looking for work in such a war-torn neighborhood. No money, she replied simply, her French accent becoming less distinct as she calmed down. How old are you? 19, she replied, but I raised my eyebrows questioningly. Well, yes, 18, she admitted. But I'll be 19 this year. You're still in school, I sighed, deciding that our 10-year age difference made her too young for me, which was a shame. Still? Hell no, the girl threw back. I've heard women deny being sluts with less anger. Her recovery from the horrible ordeal surprised me. I sighed, wondering how the hell I'd gotten myself in this position. Time to get the details. Who the hell are you, young lady, and why are you here? Shouted I. She was actually Belgian and had just left school a few weeks ago, an expensive private boarding school in England. Her father, a Belgian diplomat, was on his way with her to South Africa, where she was to spend the summer with family friends in Cape Town. On the way, they stopped for a week so her father could attend to official business, confident that the rebel army was entrenched in the south of the country and unlikely to survive the week. Unfortunately for them, some clever person had removed the trigger mechanism from a heavy machine gun and changed the course of the war, but of course they didn't know that. As it turned out, her name was Florence. Our return flight was canceled, and suddenly government soldiers were pouring into the city, fleeing the rebels. Monpap argued with some of them, and they shot him dead. They destroyed him? No, she replied, tears streaming down her cheeks at the memory. He lost a lot of blood, but the hospital was still working then and saved his life. A Red Cross plane came out and they put him on it. I just pray he's alive. Why didn't you go with him? There wasn't room. Daddy was barely conscious and I had to let him go, she sobbed, and went on to tell how she went back to the hotel where they were staying and didn't give a hoot until she was kicked out that same day, unable to pay the bill. That's how she ended up at the bar looking for a job to earn some money. There was no chance, of course, except on her back on some dirty mattress, which is where she ended up. So where are you sleeping tonight? I asked her. Where are you sleeping? She threw back nervously. We'll see about that, I hummed. Where is this hotel located? Over there, she replied, pointing to the best hotel in the place, located across the street from where we were standing. It looked pretty nice considering where we were, although it would probably be closed in Europe. I grabbed her arm and almost dragged her towards the hotel entrance, walking into the front desk looking like I owned the place. The lady wants her room back, I told the guy behind the counter, who looked Turkish but probably wasn't. She didn't pay the bill, he muttered back, ignoring me and openly scrutinizing the rip in her shirt that was too big for her. I said the lady wants her room back, I repeated, putting my hand on the hilt of my gun, and he showed clear signs of changing his mind. Then a handful of local currency thrown in front of him seemed to convince him. And a room for me, I continued, hesitating to refuse. You don't need one, Florence intervened, and this time it was she who took my hand, grabbed the keys off the counter, and dragged me toward the stairs. So we went into the room and lay down on the bed. I could have fallen in love with her, and maybe I really did. But when I arranged for her to call her parents in Belgium, which wasn't that hard in this horrible place, saw her burst into tears when she learned that her father was alive and well, and heard her mother's shouts of joy when she learned that her daughter was alive too, I sadly had to let her go. 6 days later, I put her on a plane to safety, telling her that I had bought the ticket cheaply without telling her that it had cost me a month's salary. She cried profusely from the moment we arrived at the airport until we boarded the plane. I held back the tears until she could no longer see them. It was necessary to end the war, and we left the next day. The war dragged on rather than ending with a bang. We all got the promised honors, or the next of kin of those who didn't live to see the end. I myself walked away with money I could have made in 10 years back home, tax-free, safely stashed away in an offshore bank. The question was what to do with it. I spent some of the money on a layover in Dubai, and this time I flew in something more comfortable than Vladimir's old rusty box. I tried to track down the charming Neha, but found that she had been transferred to Europe a month or so before to run a restaurant there. I consoled myself with another Russian girl, perhaps not as beautiful as Olga, but no less keen. She too turned out to be cheaper, but that may have been because I opted for a 3-day deal. Campion's arrival at my new company, JS Components Ltd., where I took a job a year or so after returning from Africa, came as a complete surprise, although perhaps it shouldn't have. We manufactured specialized gearboxes and axles, and Campion's company had previously been a customer of ours. I had dealt with JS myself when I worked at Campion, shortly before Tom took over. They hadn't done business with JS for a while, but then we hadn't had such an advanced gearbox for a long time. We made a deal with an American company and did a unit under license based on one of their designs, which gave us a technology advantage and allowed them to enter the European market. A good deal for both of us. We actually came up with a clever modification to their MK6 unit, which we shared with the Americans, and made an agreement to market it as the MK7. It all looked very promising. And then Campion came along, and all those thoughts I had kept bottled up for years came back to haunt me. Things that I thought I had put in the past suddenly started to haunt me, and haunt me hard. I hated that bitch, Jenny, of course, but the reality was something much more obvious. Something I was having a hard time dealing with. Trying to contain my hatred after what I had seen and experienced was very difficult. After showing him the factory, I ran away as fast as I could, and Campion, like me, was eager to put distance between us. The problem was that he needed our gearbox, and the truth, as unpleasant as it was that a good order from his company would solve our expansion plans. So Tom, good old boy that he was, happily left me to make arrangements with my old buddy George. George Bloody Campion, of course. The deal was to outfit 40 of their armored response vehicles for an obscure North African branch of a French company. For those in the know, that could mean they could end up anywhere from Syria to North Korea. Money talks, of course. He wanted the MK7 box, but I convinced him that due to shipping times, he'd be better off with the MK6, and of course it was slightly cheaper. He agreed, or perhaps I should say he fell for it. I may not have been the great military tactician I was made out to be, but from a business standpoint, I just set a classic trap for him. If he hadn't been so uptight about communicating with me and done his homework, he might not have gotten caught. 4 months later, I was back in Tom's office, and a rather annoyed Tom was sitting behind his desk. "What the hell were you thinking, Mike?" He pounced on me. "You should have known." "That Campion's cars were supposed to end up in Syria?" I grinned back at him. "No, I didn't know for sure, but I guessed it would be somewhere in that area." "Turned out pretty good, I reckon." "But for God's sake," he continued. "The MK6 works under license, and the Americans have embargoed their equipment. How are you going to hide that?" "You can't," I agreed, trying not to smile too broadly. "They're not going to get them." "Damn it! Who gave you the right to do something so stupid?" "Do I really have to answer that question?" I asked, maintaining a respectful demeanor. "Okay, maybe you do," Tom sighed. "So you can be the majority shareholder, but I remain managing director until I retire." "Right. That's where my hard-earned salary and bonus went. I put my cush into JS components, and with Tom's agreement, opted for shares instead of a percentage of my salary for a while, until I got a controlling interest. But by the time this all blows up, you'll be retired and sitting on some sunny beach with your wife," I reminded him. "Maybe," he agreed. "But that could send us to the bottom. What the hell are we going to do with 40 semi-outdated gearboxes?" "3," I grinned back. "And they were already in the warehouse." "What?" "All the gearboxes going through production are actually MK7S, and they are, as you know, not under license or embargo." He knew, of course. Although it wasn't widely publicized at the time, both we and the Americans were well aware, when we signed our agreement, of the advantages to both of us of having equipment that was not subject to their own embargo rules. "So you're going to replace the MK7 crates with older ones when the problem is discovered," he muttered almost to himself. "That's right," I agreed. "But not at a normal price, I suppose," Tom concluded, not fooling himself. For the first time that morning, there was a trace of a smile on his face. "Extra production costs, canceling an order, readjusting production lines, and so on and so forth. All of that costs money. The price should be much higher. All costs we won't actually incur." "Exactly," I confirmed. "More profit for us and a bigger exit bonus for you, Tom." "But why Mike?" he finally demanded. "It's not like you. The money will be welcome, but it's just not the way JS Components operates." "Let me tell you a story, Tom," I sighed, a little hunched at the thought of having to tell about the relationship between Campion and me and a certain woman named Jenny. But I did, and in all its gruesome details, and Tom even cringed, sensing my pain, when I told him about my last visit to the office and how I'd caught his wife. I think I understand, Mike, Tom told me when I finished my story. But don't let it change you. Don't let it warp your view of the world. I promised him I wouldn't let it. We broached the subject of the wine cabinet, and he left me alone. Everything fell into place almost the same day, 3 months after my meeting with Tom. Campion's company had already received 3 MK6 boxes and had done all the engineering work to fit them to their cars. They demanded more to get the production line running, at which point I bombarded them with a barrage. "We're having a bit of a supply problem," I addressed their production manager, fortunately a man I didn't know too well since he had been bought in after I left. "Hopefully there won't be any delays," he replied. "We have everything set up and the first delivery should be in a few weeks." When I suggested that he might not get them, he exploded, and I had to wait for him to calm down before continuing. I suggested he meet with his supervisor to straighten out the problem, to which he readily agreed, not realizing that I wanted to retaliate right where the problem originated. So it came out like this. "What the hell do you mean you can't supply gearboxes?" Campion snapped at me. "You've had them in production for months. If you let us down, we'll sue you." "Embargo problems," I replied calmly. "What embargo problems?" he exploded. "The French are our customers. We Brits don't have a problem with them. But our MK6 is manufactured under license from an American company, and they have a problem with a certain party in Syria." Even as I spoke those words, I could see the color leave his face. "What the hell?" He started but fell silent, knowing full well how I find out about such things. "But you should have known when we signed the order. Why didn't you say anything?" "Maybe I did, maybe I didn't," I smiled back at him. "You bastard," he hissed, finally realizing I'd set him up. "You planned this. You planned it damn well." "Just like you planned the end of my marriage," I growled back, intending to take my rage out on him. "I hope you and that bitch are still happy, because when I'm done with you, it might not last." I hadn't thought about what his reaction might be, but what I got wasn't what I expected at all. Campion, the big macho, ex-Royal Marine, ex-boxer, just burst into tears. My anger faded away and I stood there feeling nothing but embarrassment. I've seen grown men break down in the heat of battle, but this was different. I just felt awkward and didn't feel the glow of vengeance I expected. "Jenny," he finally sobbed. "We're not together anymore." "I didn't know that," I told him, my emotion utterly confused. "I caught her cheating on me," he explained. "I forgave her, but 6 months later she left and did it again. She promised to end it, but I put an investigator on her and found out she was dating one of my suppliers. It's been a few years now, and the other couple, and probably others too, were just fun on the side." "I'm sorry," I mumbled, not knowing if it was serious or not, but not knowing what else to say. We had a big fight, I kicked her out, and she went to live with her lover. I couldn't let them leave so easily, so I bankrupted the bastard. Now the couple live in a cheap rented house, drive an old wreck, and are pretty miserable by the looks of it. "And rightly so," I remarked, surprised he hadn't even considered the similarities of his situation to mine. "But I still love her, Mike," he started sobbing again. "I miss her every day." "Poetic justice," I muttered, but if he heard me, he didn't say anything back. I decided that our meeting was over, and nothing more was going to happen that day. I turned and walked out of his office, doubting that he even noticed me leaving. I spent the next day trying to gather my thoughts. My earlier plans had been shattered by my meeting with Campion. Apparently he really did love her, perhaps more than I ever had. And what did that mean? I had planned to cause him serious financial problems and perhaps even bankrupt him. But now I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of anything at all anymore. The days spent in Carl's company had changed the way I looked at the world and everything in it. We had another meeting, or actually several, and once again my plans and intentions took an unexpected turn. So much for being a great tactician. I didn't have to insist on a higher price for a more advanced gearbox, and indeed he and I hardly discussed the matter at all. Instead, to my surprise, I found myself discussing the operation of Campion's business. "I just found out that you actually own JS Components," he began our next meeting. "How the hell did you manage that?" "Came back with a shed full of money from Africa," I explained, offering no further information on exactly how I made it. I invested in JS and replaced Tom as director a couple weeks ago, but I only own a controlling interest. The other shareholders? He inquired. Old family members of the original owner. As long as they get their dividends, they don't interfere. Do you want to expand? He asked as if casually, and suddenly my interest turned entirely to him. Perhaps, I thought pertinently. Since Jenny moved out, I seem to have lost enthusiasm for the business. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have caught me in this embargoed business. I'm approaching retirement age, and Ginny's still a baby and too young to take over anytime soon, so the business may be up for sale. How much? I asked, not hiding the fact that my heartbeat had increased noticeably. He quoted a figure that seemed surprisingly reasonable, but I still crinkled my face slightly. Campion offered a slightly lower amount, and I grimaced again, but it didn't work the second time. He wasn't that desperate. I'm not sure I can raise that amount, but I'm certainly interested. The banks will help, he offered. How about half that amount, 51%, I suggested, and he sat looking at me, pondering. That would give you a controlling interest, he pointed out the obvious. That's good, but can I trust you? I sighed, seriously considered my answer, and came to the conclusion that I no longer hated this man, and after interacting with him for the past few months, I didn't even dislike him. I checked on Jenny's situation, and it was just as he said it would be. She was, well, she just didn't live in my world anymore. In my mind, she was nothing. I think you can do it, I said finally. Believe me. I really think you can do it. I think I believe you, he replied, smiled, and held out his hand for me to shake. We had to check for skeletons in the closet, and there were none. A deal was agreed, and it went through, giving me the option to buy back the remaining shares at any time over the next 5 years. I would become managing director, and George, at my suggestion, would remain chairman. It was amazing how easy it was for two men who had been cheated on by the same woman to become close. He was to become chairman of the board, but planned to stay in the background so he could spend more time with his young daughter Ginny, over whom he had custody. Upon meeting her, I was relieved to find that while she was undoubtedly pretty, I was clearly not her father. It suddenly seemed that from humble beginnings, I was at the head of my small but growing engineering empire. However, I still had a personal life. Casual liaisons with very attractive women were fun, but not what I was looking for in the long run. I wanted a pretty young woman who would become my wife, settle down in some suburb, have 2.5 kids, and of course a dog. Maybe in time? My new position gave me more opportunities to travel, and I had no trouble arranging a trip to Mumbai, where I knew for a fact lived the lovely Neha, who had moved there to work as a number 2 for her father in their hotel and restaurant business. This is Mike from Dubai, I introduced myself, calling her. Which one? She replied, rather disappointed, though of course a lot of water must have passed under a lot of bridges by then. The one with the scar, I replied, wondering if she would remember or if I was going to make a fool of myself. Oh yeah, she said encouragingly. Killed any other baddies lately? Just a few, I laughed back, wondering how she'd react if she found out how truthful my answer was. We chatted some more, reacquainting ourselves, and agreed to meet up later that night. I asked her out to dinner, but she declined, suggesting we go to some fancy bar she knew. Not hungry? I joked. Just for you, she laughed back. We have some things to do. Suddenly, I didn't feel hungry either. The bar was really fancy, very exclusive, and if I hadn't been with Neha, I probably would have had a hard time getting in there. Neha was just as sophisticated and beautiful as I remembered her to be. You left me very disappointed that night, Mike, she admitted. You're not the only one, I admitted in return. Come on, let's go meet the crowd, she said, and dragged me to the center of the place where all of Mumbai's young and rich crowd seemed to be gathered. The fact that Neha didn't stand out too much in the crowd was a testament to how beautiful the girls were. I had a whirlwind introduction, but I only remembered a few girls' names and none of the men's, and soon found myself being passed from girl to girl on the dance floor, all eager to meet the soldier of fortune who had returned from the war. I don't know what fantastic tales Neha spun them, but I soon stopped denying that I was SAS, a James Bond-type spy, a United Nations general, and even a paid assassin. True to form, I did manage to placate one young lady who asked me if it was true that I was a member of the royal family. The guys were surprisingly cooperative, considering how popular I was with their girls, though perhaps the stories, the missing finger and the scar on my cheek made them wary. A few of us moved to a private apartment nearby. Neha was with us, or at least I think she was, but the booze I had forced down my throat at some stage that night clouded my brain, and the rest of the night became very foggy. The next morning never came for me until noon, and I woke up wondering where the hell I was. I figured out that I was at least within a few hundred square miles, and only then realized that I wasn't alone in the bedroom. Finally awake? She laughed delightfully. Unless you're an angel, I grinned back, unsure if even a naked angel could be as beautiful as this girl I didn't even recognize. Breakfast? She asked. Who are you? I demanded, remembering the night before. What are you doing here? I drew the long straw, she replied, bursting into laughter at her joke. How did I do? I joked back. I don't know yet. You were totally out of it when I helped you back to my room, she informed me. Where's Neha? You mean nah, she smiled back at me. I have no idea and I don't care. So who's having breakfast, me or breakfast? I did end up enjoying breakfast, but as you'll realize, not until 4 or 5 hours later. The following week was just incredible. I managed to meet Neha and even spent the last couple nights with her. Eventually, my excuse to stay there ran out, and I was forced to leave India and return to the UK, vowing that I would be back soon. Telling Neha that I would be back to get her. However, other opportunities arose in the form of a girl from my past, and I never returned and never saw the beautiful Neha again. 7 years later, when India and Africa were just a memory, albeit a vivid one, I was running not 2 but 3 successful businesses. A medium-sized manufacturing company that fit our profile came along and was added to our company. The new company was based in Belgium and came from close family ties, which allows me to jokingly refer to our business as multinational. This and the fact that I was very happily married to a beautiful, slightly younger woman and was soon to be a father again left me a very contented man. The days of abuse were in the past, but there was still one difficult decision to be made in about a month, give or take a week or so. It was about what to name the boy we were expecting, Mike after me or Jean-Paul after my wife's father. Either way, he will join his adorable 2-year-old sister, whom we named Florence, after her mother, of course. And with that, I hope I've left enough clues for you readers to guess how my story arrived at such a happy and quite satisfying finale. I finally have a truly loving wife. A wife who still enjoys telling anyone and everyone how her husband will always be her hero and how he once saved her from a terrible fate. Maybe someday I will embarrass her like she embarrassed me by telling someone all the details. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.